my name is Avery Johnstone, and I sit within the Climate Risk and Strategy team at KPMG in the UK. And I've had the great privilege of being a participant in the Women's Forum Youth Voices initiative. We are delighted to be at the French Embassy with so many influential policymakers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and young people to introduce the Women's Forum Youth Voices initiative. At the global meeting last November in 2021, the Women's Forum launched the Youth Voices Network and invited 100 young people to participate in the meeting for the first time ever. Building on that success, the Women's Forum wanted to foster intergenerational dialogue and inclusive dialogue with more young people in the context of their work with the G7 call to action. Yesterday, 30 young people convened from around the world at Microsoft in Berlin to collaborate and ideate in policy recommendations to G7 leaders. We were split into 5 groups aligned to the Women's Forum's 5 key areas of priority: climate action, feminist foreign policy, the future of work, breaking gender bias, and access to health. These groups, led by moderators from Microsoft, HEC Paris, ESCP, Walk Free, and Bayer, have developed recommendations to share with you all today. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome the 5 representatives from these 5 groups to present their perspectives on the G7 call to action. So I'm going to call them up one by one, and they're going to share their policy recommendations with you. And then we've got one final thing to say all together. So first, Anne, if you'd like to join me at the podium.
Hi, I'm Anne, and I represent the Youth Ambassador Climate Group. Conference rooms at COP26, where critical climate-related decisions were made, showed a clear picture. They were primarily occupied by men. But should such decisions to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees be made by mostly one gender? Reports from Bloomberg revealed that companies with at least a third of their female directors had lower emission growth rates, 0.6 compared to 3.5%, than companies with a less diverse board. Further, more diverse companies also scored better in environmental disclosure. So shouldn't we encourage more diversity in boards in the face of a climate crisis? The Climate and Gender Youth Voices team thinks we should. Collaboratively, we came up with action points and recommendations to help companies align towards a gender-inclusive route in favor of the climate. Transparency and setting meaningful targets in environmental disclosure are vital for climate action, but the same applies for disclosing gender-related metrics. While such metrics are already being implemented and enforced across many G7 countries, we recommend tying them to tangible goals. Within 2 terms of board renewals, or at the latest in 2030, we recommend that at least 40% of company board members identify as women across G7 countries. But further, proper sustainability management goes beyond a company's border and thereby entails the responsibility to fully control and manage the whole supply chain. So the same reasoning is behind our call to economic actors to extend their gender-inclusive route beyond their boundaries. We recommend that by 2025, companies contract new suppliers that have at least 40% of board members who identify as women. By 2040, all suppliers should meet this 40% target. Understanding how climate issues and gender are intertwined, we firmly believe that these actions would not only strengthen but also accelerate our actions towards climate change mitigation and adaptation in order to meet the ambitious goal of net zero by 2050. Gender justice is climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Michael, if you'd like to join me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael, and I represent the Youth Ambassador Health Group. From how clinical trials are orchestrated to how heart attacks are diagnosed, the healthcare system has been designed in the image of men. Women represent over 70% of the healthcare workforce, yet occupy only 25% of leadership roles. We believe that reframing healthcare systems means empowering more women so that women's perspective on health can be accurately represented. A 2018 UK public health study found that 1 in 3 women suffer from gynecological health issues. Yet only 12% of global health spending is allocated to sexual and reproductive health. Another study by the OECD found that only 60% of women between the ages of 50 and 69 years of age have access to mammograms in G7 countries. We call for top-down measures to alleviate barriers for women ascending to leadership roles in healthcare. We call for scholarships to relieve the economic burden so disproportionately felt by women pursuing careers in health. We call for zero pay gap policies in healthcare institutions. And we call for policies that defend and protect fertility autonomy. Access to contraception and to abortion is indisputable in the path towards equal opportunity. From the bottom up, we call for more educational opportunities and initiatives that inspire women to pursue and study STEM. We call for increased mentorship programs to guide women professionals in the healthcare system. Representation generated by investing in women, by equal pay, by fertility autonomy, and by education and mentorship. With these initiatives, we can change the healthcare system, a system that acknowledges and reflects women's perspectives, a system that deploys research capital equitably, a system with leaders as diverse as its patients. Thank you.
Sheba, if you'd like to join me.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sheba George. I am a youth delegate of the Feminist Diplomacy and Foreign Policy Group of the Women's Forum. If I may, I'd like to call your attention to the fact that it's 2022, and not a single country in the world has achieved gender equality completely. This striking reality is even reflected in the representation of the G7. As you may have noticed, not a single G7 country is this year represented by a female head of state. This, ladies and gentlemen, is indicative of where we really are with gender equality today. Despite decades of contributions and progress in this sector, the reality is that, for the most part, women's rights, their needs, and women themselves continue to be underrepresented. This is the basis of our call to action to G7 leaders. We urge G7 leaders to adopt and implement feminist foreign and trade policies for the protection and promotion of women's rights and representations, not only in G7 countries, but also throughout the world. We're asking for support through financial mechanisms, support through structural changes that protect women's rights, and support through key sectors that empower women. Our recommendations, therefore, are, firstly, that all G7 leaders and their states adopt feminist foreign policies, and as part of this, ensure that at least 85% of their official development assistance is provided to addressing gender as a significant or principal goal by 2025. And of this, at least 20% from the current less than 5% is dedicated to achieving gender as a main objective within their official development assistance policies and programs. We also ask that all 100% of the official development assistance is screened through the OECD's gender equality policy marker so that we can track commitment towards gender equality in an accountable and transparent fashion. Secondly, we ask G7 leaders to facilitate systematic change in their supply chains and trade processes. We call upon them to recognize the alarming fact that 1 in every 130 women today are subject to modern slavery. And with more than 190 million women working in supply chains throughout the world, this is inevitable that a significant portion of them will be vulnerable to structural abuse, including forced labor and modern slavery. We therefore ask that G7 leaders systematically and critically assess their own supply chains and trade agreements and adopt and implement a gender-sensitive and human rights just supply chain and trade processes. And not just in G7 countries, but also that they advocate for such trade agreements to be implemented worldwide. Lastly, we urge G7 leaders to support sectors that are critical to women's empowerment, such as education and health, and to increase the financing and policy support provided to these sectors. In terms of education specifically, we ask that at least 15% of the official development assistance budget is dedicated to education with a particular focus on women and girls' education. Under health, we ask that financing for the health sector, and particularly reproductive health and family planning, is increased from the current very insignificantly low rate of 0.1% of the official development assistance budget of G7 countries. We ask that financing for both these sectors and other sectors critical to women's empowerment are increased. Lastly, we urge G7 leaders to understand the urgency of the situation and to make a public commitment to achieve these objectives at least by 2025, so that we can continue to make the much needed progress in this sector in an accountable, in a transparent, and in a consistent manner. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I'd like to say there's a lot left to be done. And therefore, we're very grateful for all of your attention today to the Women's Forum for facilitating this process. And my sincere thanks in advance to the G7 leaders for taking our actions, our recommendations into sincere consideration. Thank you.
Marie-Alix.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marie-Alix, and I'm representing the Gender Bias Group for the Youth Ambassadors. 0 hour. 0 hour is the average paternity leave within 4 out of 7 G7 countries, while maternity leave accounts for 10.8 weeks. This example illustrates the issue we aim G7 leaders to tackle. Still today, women are seen as caregivers and associated with domestic work and the upbringing of children. Maternal leave is implementing over paternal leave as the preferred option in both the private and the public sectors. Domestic work and raising children are still seen as unpaid work, and thus they form the core of long-lasting economic inequalities for women. There are many implications arising from this gender bias. For instance, the imbalance of parental leave policies leads to further unequal access to job opportunities, increase in gender pay gap, and ultimately, a lack of female role model for women. Our recommendations for G7 leaders today are the following. First, to assess the status quo, we ask to collect, monitor the data about parental, maternal, and paternal leaves within both the public and the private sectors, included but not limited to the proportion of employees taking the leaves, the duration of the leave, the return to work rate, all disaggregated by genders. Second, we call to create a sustainable framework of parental leave for both the private and the public sectors. And lastly, we call to create an entitled income-related parental leave to provide financial insurance for parents and incentivizing them to take the leave offer. Ultimately, I want a world where the sacrifice between having a family and ascending in one's career never has to be made. And I want this opportunity for every person in this room. Thank you.
And last, but certainly not least, Eleonora.
Good evening. I'm Eleonora, and I'm from the Jobs of the Future group. How many of you here ever heard about Hedy Lamarr? How many of you in the audience? You can raise your hands. Yeah, I'm not that surprised that there are very few raised hands, 3 or 4. Hedy Lamarr is the woman behind the advances in communication technology that happened in the 1940s and that led to technologies that we now know pretty well: the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, the GPS. I learned about the scientific contributions of Mrs. Lamarr only a few days ago, and I thought, why I didn't know this before? And I'm pretty sure that many of you now are wondering the same. Women always strive to receive recognition and equal opportunities in scientific and technological fields. They still do. STEM careers are the jobs of the future. According to data, 70% of future jobs will indeed require STEM-related skills. But today, only 28% of STEM students globally are women. This gender disparity is alarming, and we, as the youth representatives, recommend the G7 leaders to tackle the issue through the following 3 points. First, education. Leveraging on the already mentioned Women's Forum call to actions, we call the G7 leaders to restructure and expand current primary curricula with STEM qualifications, and to upskill and reskill women in workforce through government funding support programs. Second, financial support. We call the G7 leaders to allocate national public investment funds towards women-owned businesses and STEM businesses which already enforce diversity in the workforce. 3, visibility. We urge the G7 leaders to implement national campaigns promoting a platform for visibility and networking for women in STEM. As representatives of the youth, we demand all G7 leaders and countries to take action. If not addressed now, women underrepresentation and the lack of diversity in the future labor force will not only hinder businesses, but it will hinder societies as a whole. Thank you.
A massive thank you to each one of you. Can we get another round of applause for all of the young people in this audience? Very well done. So we're not quite done yet, but before we do, there are many, many thank yous that Virginie alluded to and said that I also feel like need to be said. But thank you very much to the Women's Forum for their investment in time and resources to be able to facilitate this kind of youth initiative. Being able to foster this intergenerational dialogue is incredibly important to accelerating solutions. So thank you to the Women's Forum. Thank you to Microsoft for their support for this initiative. Thank you to the French Embassy for hosting us, and to the Women's Forum's broader community of partners, collaborators, speakers, moderators, and the audience. Your attention and your support has been incredibly valuable to us as young leaders. And we have had a fantastic day. It's not quite over, but we will have a cocktail in it's called the Rue de France, I just learned. But the lobby where we've been having lunch, there'll be lovely cocktails for us to enjoy and continue our networking. But before we end, I really do want to end with these young women. And so we're going to do one very quick round of one word each, where you will each summarize kind of what the last 2 days has meant to you, or what your summary of the last 2 days has been. So if you want to grab the mic, we can go around one by one. We'll have to share mics.
Does this
work?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Eleonora.
From my side, I'd say shared leadership.
Amazing. Marie-Alix.
I would say empowerment.
I would say persistence to keep going at all the things we need to do in this sector.
I would say collaboration.
And I would end with rethinking.
Amazing. Once again, thank you all very much, and thank you. We're going to grab a photo of us. You're free to go.